Welcome to 80s TV Ladies with your fabulous hosts, Sharon Johnson and Susan Lambert-Haddam.
Hello, I'm Sharon.
And I'm Susan. Today's guest is very special to me. I was reading her book, loving it, and thinking the whole time, well, heck, we should have her on the show. And then guess what, Sharon? We got her.
Woohoo! And in kicking off season 3, we wanted to get another overview of the television landscape and history, like we did at the beginning of season 2, when we talked with our friend and the creator of the podcast, Advanced TV Herstory, Cynthia Bemis Abrams.
And I wanted to bring on someone this season who could give us even more context about the history of women in television. So why not the woman who wrote the book on it, When Women Invented Television, by Jennifer Keishan Armstrong.
Jennifer has written 8 books, including New York Times bestseller Seinfeldia, the aforementioned When Women Invented Television, Mary Lou and Rhoda and Ted, as well as Sex and the City and Us.
Her latest book, So Fetch, A Cultural History of Mean Girls, published in January 2024.
Jennifer, welcome to 80s TV Ladies. We're thrilled to have you with us this afternoon.
Thank you for having me.
We are really happy. I have to tell you, finding your book, When Women Invented Television, which I have right here, gave me such great context when I was starting the podcast. And I had not heard about Gertrude Berg. So that was very exciting. And then I realized you had also written the Mary Tyler Moore book. So I was like, I wonder if I can get her on the show. And we did.
Well, that makes me very happy because those are 2 of my favorites.
They're fantastic.
They're
really fun reads and I enjoy them.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about what your process is when you start writing one of these books, how you choose a topic and so on?
Those 2 books that you mentioned are both a little different from each other. So they had slightly different processes, but a book like the Mary Tyler Moore Show book, which I've written several books about, like specific shows, Seinfeld, Sex and the City. In that case, it's a little more focused just because you're looking at a list of TV shows, right? To start with. And I literally do that sometimes. And then it's kind of like there's some ineffable qualities, right? In some cases, I'm waiting for time to pass. I feel like we just got to a point where I could start writing about like 2000s shows. You have to know for a fact that it's sticking around and still has resonance and all of that stuff. Then I'm looking for a story to tell. Right. It isn't just, I like this show. People love to, at cocktail parties, say to me, like, you should do whatever, name this show. And I always just say like, yeah, maybe, but really I'm thinking like, here's all the reasons that won't work. And, big part of like the Mary Tyler Moore Show book was, yes, the show was super important to me. Yes, I loved the show. But it was also that I was interviewing at that time. I worked at Entertainment Weekly and I was interviewing a lot of women that at that time current like television and comedy, which would have been the 2000s and 2010s. And they would all mention, Julia Louis-Dreyfus, Mindy Kaling, all of these people would mention the Mary Tyler Moore Show. And that was the first like, that's interesting that people are still looking to that show. And then also once I did some research, I realized that it was the first show to have kind of multiple women writing for it, as opposed to like one woman on staff who is paired with a man. Then I thought, oh, there's a story to tell, which I was correct about. And I really focused my interviews on those women who wrote for the show. They were all bringing their own lives into the show. And of course, by definition, women who were these pioneers are going to have great stories. And so that was why I really started to think, okay, there's something very much here. So that's the kind of thing I'm looking for. And I'm also personally very interested in specifically social resonance. So I want to see a show that had an artistic impact on shows after it. And I want to see a show that made a social impact as well, that changed. I always like to think of it as like that changed actual people's actual lives, whether it's as simple as they quote it a bunch of times or they see themselves in the characters and it changes the way they act, or in this case, it was an avatar of the entire feminist movement of the 1970s. And it kind of ended up channeling what was going on in activism into a television show. And not all of the activists loved it, but it was, in fact, Mary throwing her hat in the air is the emblem of female independence. And so all those things came together for me. And that was why I thought like, oh, this is going to be good. And with When Women Invented Television, it did come from my research on the Mary Tyler Moore Show specifically. Jim Brooks and Alan Burns, who made the Mary Tyler Moore Show, when I asked them what the inspiration was for Rhoda, the character who is Mary's best friend, they mentioned a lot of different things. It wasn't just this, but one thing they mentioned in passing was they mentioned, oh, and we were thinking about Jewish women in television and media from the past, and we were thinking about Gertrude Berg. And really, I think what they actually said was Molly Goldberg, her character's name. And I was like, I don't hold the phone. I have no idea what you're talking about, right? And they were like, oh, you need to go look her up. She was super famous. And I'm like, that's weird that I don't know who that is when I kind of consider myself a nerd about television history and women in particular. And indeed, when I looked it up, it's like she was the Oprah of her time. She had the first successful family sitcom, period. She wrote, starred in, directed, produced the whole thing. She was on the radio for 20 years before that, and then brought it to television. The show was so successful that it was the first show made into a movie. She had a line of house dresses. She had a cookbook, all of this stuff. She was really big. And I thought, that's weird. And I kind of filed that away. And the other thing they said to me was that when we talked about Betty White on the Mary Tyler Moore Show, they said, well, it was sort of like a joke on Betty White's persona. They described her in the initial script as a Betty White type who is then kind of a horrible bitch the minute the cameras turn off, which Betty is not. Betty was not. But, that was how they described it. And they were like, oh, it was really funny because it turned out we could get, Mary was friends with Betty and we could get her. We didn't know that was going to happen. We just described her that way. And I was like, okay, but that's weird to me because I don't know what a Betty White type is before the Mary Tyler Moore Show. That was my first encounter with her in television history. And so they said, oh yeah, she had a whole career before that. You should look it up. And again, I went, and it was shocking because she was, along with Gertrude Berg, one of the first women to produce her own sitcom. And in addition to that, she was just one of the first people, literally on television, like in a test screening when she was a teenager. And then even so, then going forward, she was one of the first TV stars in Los Angeles because she was on this morning talk show and ended up being on screen just hours and hours and hours a day because they just didn't know what else to do. They just, in daytime television, they were like, more Betty White, unscripted. And they did 6 days a week.
That's so crazy.
Wild, right?
Wow.
And then remember that she is then also going to shoot her live sitcom on Friday nights. It's crazy. Just think of how much she was working, how much she wanted this. She left her husband to be, he said, I don't want a career woman as a wife. And she said, I will choose television because I love my job that much. And again, this does kind of dovetail in with what I was saying about the Mary Tyler Moore Show in the sense that it's like, once you start to see this, you go like, oh, there's a story here. And then once I did a little bit of research, I realized that there were tons of women doing this work at that time. Pre-Lucy is kind of the way I was seeing it. That Lucy, I used to think Lucy, oh my God, it's amazing that the first gigantic television star happens to be a woman too. And that's true.
She seemed to be a unicorn.
Right. Exactly.
But she wasn't.
But she wasn't really. She's incredible in a million other ways. I don't want to take anything away from that. But she wasn't the only one. And that was what I sort of saw as like, oh, I don't want to tell Lucy's story because that's been told and then retold quite recently in a couple of ways. But this was my way of kind of saying like, oh, she was great, but she wasn't alone. Gertrude was before her. And I ended up I made a big list and chose the 4 women that I kind of focused on to kind of tell the bigger story of women were doing all kinds of different things in television. And 2 of them were Gertrude and Betty.
And the other 2, Irma Phillips and Hazel Scott. I knew of her from the piano stuff. I did not know she had television.
Because it was so short-lived.
I don't think I knew anything about her at all. So
I didn't really either. And there are people, though, I would say especially jazz people really did know, when I would mention her, they go, oh yeah, Hazel Scott, she would play 2 pianos at once.
Yeah, I think I saw that 2 piano clip at some point in, I don't know.
Yeah, that was going around pretty recently. Alicia Keys did a tribute to her, in fact, at the Emmy. She just mentioned it briefly. She said, oh, I'm playing 2 pianos like Hazel Scott. And a lot of people searched for it after that and saw her. I usually describe her as the Beyonce of her time. She was also shockingly famous for a person that a lot of us don't. Like, imagine if in 40, 50 years, people didn't know who Beyonce was all of a sudden. Couldn't happen. But Hazel Scott, she was so famous and then had this unfortunate downslide because she ended up being blacklisted and left the country. So that's why you haven't heard of her. But at the time, her TV claim to fame is she was this stunning woman who was so charismatic, would dress perfectly. And she was married to Adam Clayton Powell Jr., who was this very famous congressman. And they were kind of this power couple. And they were very active in early civil rights actions, that kind of thing. She would not play segregated venues, for instance. She'd walk out if she walked in and saw that it was segregated. And then they'd kind of purposely like call the press and do the whole thing. So she got a television show on this fourth network called the Dumont Network that died kind of shortly after. But at the time, I think partly because they were a fourth network, the others had come from radio and they hadn't. So I think they were more willing to take chances. And so they had more diversity than the other networks. And, you know, in the big cities, they knew that they could get a Black audience. Lots of people loved her, including white people, but they knew this was going to be great. And jazz and all of this stuff, it's so sophisticated. And they were really focusing on the cities at the time because that's where most of television was. So she had this variety show, and it was very common at that time to have these shows where you'd hire a musician, and it was essentially them playing. For most of the time, they might have some guests come on. Part of the reason we don't know about this, and she was the first Black person, male or female, to host a primetime national television show, period.
And that was 1950. Yeah.
And so it seemed to be going really well. The reason that I can even tell you what happened on the show is because I read all of the weekly reviews in the trade magazines at that time, and they were pretty descriptive. There are no recordings of the show. And I really believe this is a huge reason we haven't heard of her, because we can't see them the way we could see I Love Lucy. It was live. It was this network that died. And there is probably an apocryphal story that they dumped all of the tapes into the East River after Dumont died and was bought by ABC, that ABC was like, we don't need this. I don't really believe that that's true, but it's a great story. It's a great visual. And certainly what we do know is we can't find tapes of this woman's show. So we can't actually see it. But there were these descriptions. And from what I understand from the descriptions, it was this very elegant thing. She would wear these beautiful dresses. She had full wardrobe approval for any project she did. She was very, very smart about this because she knew where people wanted to railroad her. And she always had to play herself. And she always got wardrobe approval. And this kept her away from what she called singing maid roles, which was extremely common at that time. That was like your only way in as a Black woman. And she said, nope, I'm going to play two pianos instead. It looked like a beautiful New York City penthouse, and she would play her music, and she looks great on screen. And it was going really, really well. And they were getting like more and more interest, more and more local affiliates were picking it up.
Yeah.
As the show went on throughout 1950, the reviews were universally positive. They all kept saying, like, we need more Hazel Scott. She went from like 15 minutes to 30 minutes. She went from one night a week to several. And then this publication came out where a bunch of people were named as possible communists, as they say. And that was it. She was done. And she was so fed up that she left the country. I mean, that not right away, but she basically went to Paris. And I think all of these things together are reasons we don't know who she is now. But she was very big in her day. And Irma Phillips was the essentially inventor of the soap opera genre. She started on radio. They asked her to make something that appealed to women because they wanted to sell women's stuff in advertisements. Of course, this is always how it goes. And she came up with essentially a very, very serialized family drama and was incredibly successful at this. Even on the radio, she was making something like $250,000 a year in the 40s.
Wow.
Remember, in the 40s. This is like millions of dollars equivalent now. She had this huge empire. And eventually, after a few tries, it was not easy to just hop it on over. But she brought it over from radio to television and eventually had both kind of her own empire. So like As the World Turns and Guiding Light are her big inventions. And think of how those
I was going to say, those we know
recent
of.
memory. Yeah.
We know of because they lasted a very long time. Are they
Crazy.
the longest running television
Yes, Guiding
shows?
Light was.
Okay.
Guiding Light was because the record is held over from radio too.
Right.
She tried a few like new ones on TV and they didn't work. But her big brainstorm that worked was that she just was like, why don't we just bring Guiding Light over? This is like one day it's on radio and the next day it's on radio and TV. So they would simulcast. And you'd hear the audio. So it was like, so she brought her fans over to television, which of course they wanted to see the people. Why wouldn't you want to see the people, right? That's so exciting at that time. And that was the real key, is that you could actually get it either place for a while. And from there, she was able to build this empire. And basically, she also mentored so many people in this form that all of the shows that came after, even the other shows, were still basically her proteges making those shows too. Days of Our Lives, all of these other shows, All My Children, or, Agnes Nixon, many people have heard of, and that was a protege of hers. So, she was just really like the epicenter of the soap opera. And I think of also just, yes, there's the daytime soap opera, and even the organ cues came from her. The thing we think of is kind of that schmaltzy, like dun dun, and they look at each other. She came up with that because Guiding Light was about a priest initially. And so the idea was supposed to be the organ sounded like, the organ at church. And she always said later, she's like, I'm sorry about that. I really didn't mean it to be like everyone did it. But she loved a long dramatic pause. I looked at a lot of her notes in her archive, and often there would be notes to the director that said, more dramatic pauses, please. She loved that. And she really knew her audience. She knew they were housewives. She was very conscious of catering to them. She would often try to like make sure they were explaining what was happening on the show in addition to acting it out, because the housewives might be like doing the ironing or doing the dishes. And so it was like both her radio training and thinking about their lives. The executives often argued with her about this, but she knew better and eventually turned it into the longest running television drama of all time, in addition to kind of coming up with the idea of cliffhangers every episode, which I think of Netflix now and how driven that is by us wanting to like keep playing.
What's so interesting in hearing you, in reading about how she was working this out, right? That it wasn't invented, right? She had to invent it as the technology was inventing,
That's right.
and moving forward. And I was like, oh, it's like podcasts, because so many people listen to podcasts while they work around the house, while they do their other errands of the day, or, and I was like, oh, it's sort of this weird, like we've gone back. And then Dumont television, the way you describe it too, which I had never heard of, was kind of like the Netflix. Like they were a technology company, right? They started just by inventing television stuff, TV.
Yeah.
And then they were like, oh, I guess we should have programming because we're inventing television.
Well, they invented cable in my own hometown of Allentown, Pennsylvania.
Yes,
the
that's
first
right.
cable company.
Dumont.
That's right.
Okay.
They became Dumont, but the first coaxial cable was laid down in Allentown, Pennsylvania. And their first office, I was looking at the pictures, was on 14th and Chew or something.
Did you walk right past there in your childhood?
Yeah. Oh, small. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cable was invented not for what we think of now. It was invented to get TV to places where they couldn't get the signals to reach. It wasn't everywhere at this time, which is actually very important to things like, for instance, you could actually have more women and more people of color on in those earlier days when they were mostly only in cities. It was really when they started going into rural areas and the South that things got weird, because suddenly they're getting complaints that there are Black people on television, and those are coming from the South. Betty White ran into this too. She had a lovely dancer named Arthur Duncan when she had her own talk show, and got a lot of letters that she wasn't ready for because she was used to Los Angeles. And then suddenly she was getting letters that were complaining, and she was like, no, we're not getting rid of him. That's ridiculous. It was this weird time where all of a sudden it's like Gertrude Berg was super, super Jewish. They would do a Passover episode. And when they first started, it just was fine for everyone because they're live and they're in mostly New York City. And then it's like, again, when they start going further out, they start watering down the show and the TV starts getting watered down the same way. That's when we get into the Father Knows Best era.
As far as Irma Phillips is concerned, I, as a soap opera watcher and as a watcher of As the World Turns and Guiding Light, amongst others, I knew about her, probably because the soap opera press kept her alive in articles and through her proteges who are now running all of these shows. But, you know, even though I knew of Betty White primarily from the Mary Tyler Moore Show, or maybe initially, I had no idea until most recently about her previous television career. What's your sense of why some of this information has not carried forward on a number of these women the way that it has for a number of their male counterparts?
I mean, there you go. It's pretty hard. We do have the issue for some of them, for some of these works of, you know, not being able to see the tape. But that's not true of Betty's early work. I mean, some of Gertrude's is lost, but I have the DVD set and a lot of it does exist. So that's not it entirely. So I really think there has to be some overt sexism here. And it's like, I wish I could say something else. You know what I mean? Like, I wish I had a better explanation, but it's the sexism and the blacklist, which the blacklist to me is about sexism and racism to a large extent. It's interesting how many women and people of color and Jews were on the list, right? Just a coincidence.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's like they wanted to get rid of certain people. And I would say also the white men, I even read stories of other white men who did get a little sucked into the blacklist and then kind of got out. Like, kind of just weird how white men can just sort of land on their feet. But, you know, it was much harder for other people.
And quite honestly, the biggest people I know from the blacklist are white men. Like, now that you're saying it, of course, there were women and Jewish people and people of color on that list. Of course there were. But I couldn't tell you except for the ones that I read about in your book.
Because they were never heard from again. Whereas the white men kind of recovered and then they could be like, oh, this weird thing happened to me. What? Right?
Yeah. They could talk about it.
Yeah. And Gertrude also, we didn't mention this, but she kind of got sucked into the blacklist in this weird sideways way where her co-star on her show who played her husband, Philip Loeb, was blacklisted. Huge guy in the labor movement in Hollywood. He was blacklisted for quite obvious reasons. He's Jewish and this huge labor leader, and he never recovered. And she resisted for a while. And basically, this is why I think part of why we don't know who she is her show was taken off the air at its heights. The next thing that was about to happen to that show was it was going to be paired with I Love Lucy, which was new. And you see how this is. This is actually that they thought, oh, I Love Lucy might get a boost from being with the Goldbergs, is what they were thinking at the time. Because it was this new show. And instead, I Love Lucy came on the next year and just was a hit instantly. And it should have been with the Goldbergs, but the Goldbergs was off the air because Loeb was blacklisted and Gertrude was being pressured and she was saying no. So they were kind of in this limbo state of negotiating behind the scenes to try to keep him on. And she did that for a few seasons and it just didn't work. So she eventually said, you can decide for yourself if this is okay or not, but it is what it is. She just said, like, I employed a number of people here and I don't want to let them down and I can't have them continue to be unemployed because we're doing this. So they made a deal where Philip Loeb would be paid as long as the show was on, but would not be on the show. But going back to your question about why we don't know them too, like, I got this book that was supposed to be this definitive history of early television for research. And I just bought it without even looking at it because I was like, I'm sure there's going to be stuff in here about these women. And I went to the back to the index and I looked for Gertrude Berg and she wasn't there.
Wow. And
I was genuinely shocked by this. I guess some of the other women, it's like, okay, maybe Irma Phillips isn't there because we're focusing on prime time. And Betty White, I think maybe at least got to mention because she's super, super, super famous to this day. But I was really, really shocked by the lack. And I'm like, are her years in here? Yes, the years she was active are here. You know, Milton Berle is here, who she was very good friends with. Why do we all know who Milton Berle is? And I think he would be mad that we all know who he was and we do not know who she was, because she was on his show a bunch of times as a guest star and he loved her and really was always kind of a cheerleader for her and understood how talented she was. It's fun to watch any of these women if you go look them up online. All of them, I mean, Irma wasn't on screen, but the other three, it's like, if you want to know what a TV star looks like, any of these women have it. You know, that thing that's just, you want to watch them and have them in your living room all the time. All of them had this. And Gertrude is a very fun example of this. She really had a special talent.
Are you hopeful that some of those lost things would be found someday?
I am. I mean, I know for a fact that there's this ongoing attempt to find Hazel's lost tapes, because those are really like, they're all lost. And then Gertrude, we have a fair amount. I was able to watch a fair amount of her show, which is great. It was important to see that one in particular because it's the family sitcom format and it's evolving before your eyes. And I have to say, what's funny is some of the best episodes are the earliest ones because it's kind of weird. It's weird to watch early TV because they actually didn't know what TV was supposed to look like.
Yeah.
Which is very strange to think about, right? That they don't know what a family sitcom is yet. They don't know they have to have a sofa here and all of that stuff, though that is essentially what she is doing. This is a little bit of a bummer, but that show has a little bit of a sad progression if you watch it through, because it starts out just really innovative. It gets weird in the middle because of losing Philip Loeb. At one point, they're like, maybe we should do 15 minutes instead of a half an hour. So for a while, it's 15 minutes, which feels like more like sketch comedy than it is a sitcom.
Yeah.
And then they go back to 30, and then they go with a syndicated service instead of a network. And this is when we start to get into Father Knows Best era. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, like they become a Father Knows Best clone. They move to the suburbs and they kind of de-Jewishify a lot. And it becomes all about, like, by that time, the daughter has grown up and she's a teenager and she's hot. And so all of a sudden, every episode is about, like, Rosie's going on a date. Doesn't she look cute? Like, that is so strange.
It's like you're watching the evolution of television in one show.
It's interesting as a student, but disheartening as a watcher, you know, because you can kind of see Gertrude figuring out that she has no choice but to compromise herself. I mean, there's this really sad part, and I talk about this in the book. There's an earlier episode where I don't know how she gets involved, but she gets involved in, like, maybe somebody's selling weight loss stuff. And she's very, like, the conclusion is very like, I don't need that. And she's a big woman. Also, like, in her 50s by the time she's on television, which is, and she's like, no, it's fine. I have small children. Yeah. You believe me. It's fine. And then by the last seasons, there's this other episode that's extremely depressing where her husband basically says she's fat and she goes to a fat camp. She does rebel. She, like, goes into town and brings a bunch of cold cuts back to the what they literally call a fat farm in this. This is not me saying this. So she rebels a little and then she gets kicked out. But then when she goes home, her husband's like, no, you're still fat. And she's like, oh, you're probably right. And it's very sad. She doesn't say, like, screw you, who cares? We've been married for, 30 years. And then she, like, goes into the kitchen and, like, sneaks a bunch of spaghetti. And that's the episode. It's kind of bleak. Like,
that's terrible. All right. We have to take a quick break, but then we're going to be right back.
Yes.
And we're back. I'm so excited.
I have to have Betty White, and she's going to kind of be my daytime talk person because she was my Trojan horse.
Yeah.
To be honest, I wanted her in there because I knew people would at least be like, oh, Betty White, I love her. I was hoping to some extent they might not know everything about her early career. I also wanted people to understand, like, she isn't just like a old lady who says dirty things and then we laugh. This was a feminist pioneer badass. And you need to understand what she did, and a lot of people, like you said, didn't know this about her.
Yeah. I mean, I think that it is sort of amazing when you realize just how long her career was. And then to read about what early television was, which was insane. And because it was all live, basically, right? So the idea that you would just sit down and talk for 5 hours Hello, we're just going to talk. I'm your best friend all day long. And we're just going to sit here and talk. And like, it's, that is really fascinating. And that she was just like the original improv star, basically, of all time.
Right, exactly. And to me, what I always say too is with Betty, I think that explains so much. Mm-hmm. Once you know this woman is on 5 and 6 hours a day, 6 days a week with no script, there's nothing that could scare her after that, right? There's nothing that's going to shake this woman in front of a camera. And she just knows how to be with a camera. And you can find some of this online. Her solo talk show that was national on NBC called The Betty White Show, you can find some of the footage. And a lot of it is where she actually looks directly into the camera and talks or sings sometimes, which is fun. And that is not easy to do in a way that isn't weird. And she could just talk directly to a person through the screen and just had this magic.
I was also surprised to hear about the number of women behind the scenes in the early television. And it reminds me of what was happening in early film too, because nobody wanted to be there.
That's right. That's exactly it. That's the only...
Yeah. But it was an opportunity. And I think it's also the same thing that happened with early music videos.
Yeah.
It's how women got to direct early music videos was because they were like the assistants in the office at the music companies. Mm-hmm. And they were like, well, we need somebody to make this video. And they're like, well, I'll do it. Like, and suddenly you become a music video director. Like in the book, you're saying like almost 25%?
Yeah, I believe that that's correct. And that's my own, by the way, that was me because of course there had no numbers and it was also weird, but it's basically me with Wikipedia making the best list I could. And there isn't that much TV, so it wasn't that hard. It was like looking at primetime, you just go through and here we go. And yeah, my estimation was it was roughly a quarter. And at the time I was writing the book, that was the same. It was the same percentage of women working behind the scenes as showrunners and things like that. I think the numbers have gotten a little bit better. I think we're heading toward 50%. I think we're getting really close if we haven't quite gotten there. But that was pretty shocking to me to realize, like in the era of Shonda Rhimes, yes, we have Shonda Rhimes and that's great, but it's like still, there's a huge drop. Like you said, essentially 1955 blows everything to pieces and there's no women behind the scenes. And then we basically slowly build back up all the way till now.
And what do you think that is? What do you attribute that to?
I mean, I thought a lot about this just for framing the book and everything. And I have 1955 down as like essentially the death
hammer
knell. Yeah. Father Knows Best is the best example, right? It's literally called Father Knows Best. It's about a white family in the suburbs where dad works, mom wears a skirt while lightly cleaning at all times and like brings him a drink when he comes home. And he knows best. It is the patriarchy, right? And that show comes on right around that time. I mean, when we talk about Make America Great Again, that's what people are talking about. They're talking about a fake thing on television from a very specific time. And that's it. That like it was all suddenly white people in the suburbs with 2 kids and a dog. And that's the only people who existed. To me, what's important is that television becomes big business, which it wasn't, as you alluded to before. Like the reason women and people of color were allowed to do things is because the white men were overrunning radio still, because that's where money was. The minute there was money to be made here and that most people had television, all of a sudden it happens real fast. Sort of, I mean, we've experienced this in our lifetime with things like the internet and then streaming.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Remember, I mean, I did stories not that long ago where everyone in the industry was like, no, network's going to be here forever. Streaming is never going to take over. We're never going to debundle, ESPN from this and HBO from that. And it's like, here we are. No one has TV anymore. So very similarly, it just became ubiquitous. It became powerful. It became a moneymaker. And then the white men swept in and cleaned house. I quote some internal memos and things from NBC at that time where they're literally calling women dames in memos, which actually I kind of like, but like they're talking dismissively about like, oh, dames like emotional upsets in their daytime television. We need more emotional upsets on this Betty White show. So they make her do like surprise reunions and things, which I'm not saying isn't good television, but like it's because But the way they talk about it, it's not like because it's good television, because it's like no dames like this. One of my other favorite examples from that actually is that Eisenhower gets elected and everybody kind of notices women were actually super important in electing him, both in working for his campaign and also as voters. And so this is a big news item. Oh my God, women helped Ike get elected. And there's all this chatter behind the scenes. Maybe we should do something about this. This is so interesting. And then they take a total wrong turn. They're like, oh, this Eisenhower thing, women seem to be really important and powerful. We should add more like fashion segments to the daytime television show. Like, I can't even explain to you how that was their thinking, but that was an actual memo that I read. It was like, women are powerful, but why wouldn't you give them political programming if that's what just happened? But they still couldn't see it that way.
I'm suddenly reminded of the day after the first Women's March.
That's right.
Right. Millions, the biggest march in history, worldwide, certainly across the country, the biggest march ever. In every city. Millions.
Yeah.
The front of the LA Times, big headline. Women's March is huge. Can it sustain? I was like, what do we have to do? Seriously.
Yep.
What do we have to do?
Exactly. Yeah. So the men were in charge. And so even if women were showing their power, the men didn't get it. And men were in charge. So this is just the way it was. And I cannot even believe this, but Betty White got fired after 1 year doing her national talk. Can you imagine? I'm just imagining firing Betty White. That's the part that I'm just like, you could see the male executives sort of behind the scenes in their memos trying to figure out what to do. And they just couldn't, they didn't get it. They didn't know what to do. And so she was fired and she actually thought her career was over, which is hilarious. But like, there's no reason she wouldn't think that at that time. Right. And for a while it was like, she's doing the Rose Parade, which is cool. And then she gets on Password and stuff in the 60s. And it really isn't until the Mary Tyler Moore Show that we see the comedic actual genius she is. Everyone go watch Betty White on the Mary Tyler Moore Show. It is unbelievable. Like, she's on fire. They don't even start counting women in television until the 70s, which, you know, like having counts that we can see and know the percentage of women working on things. And to be honest, they probably didn't need to bother. If you go look at things like Bewitched or I Dream of Jeannie, which are female-centric shows, it's all men. I mean, there were a couple women, but it's barely any women. And so really, it isn't until the 70s and the women's movement and shows like the Mary Tyler Moore Show employing actual women to write actual women's stories. Brilliant. And, you know, you really still needed male allies there, right? You needed people like Jim Brooks and Alan Burns to go, cool that we're doing the show, but what if, and hear me out, what if we talk to some women?
And get them to write this show?
That's why that show was so good. And I think noticeably different. I mean, that girl was important and Marlo Thomas is an incredible feminist activist, but it really wasn't until Mary being 30 and the executives even said, like, does she have to say she's 30? And they were like, yes. She's 30, she's single. She remains single for the whole show, which means most of her 30s. Oh my God. She doesn't seem like she's really worried about it.
Yeah, she's happy.
Yeah.
She's happy. That's the best thing about that show.
The weird thing is, like, early days, they do a lot more dating. And then they start to realize, like, nobody really cares about the dating. She goes on dates sometimes. They're not really good. And like, you watch her real trajectory is like she becomes this power suit wearing executive by the time the show's over and gets this like beautiful apartment and is killing it. And there's no hint of a man. And that's amazing. But that's the first time like the WGA starts to have a women's group within it during the time of the Mary Tyler Moore Show. And that is one of their first demands is we need to start counting women so that we know how many there are. And the great thing about the Mary Tyler Moore Show was that those women were all mentored from almost no experience. A few of them had, you know, Treva Silverman was the one who had experience coming into it. Everyone else, it was like they were pulling secretaries. You know, do you have a story to tell? Great, we'll mentor you. And that to me was truly Jim Brooks and Alan Burns were revolutionary in this act. You have to give them credit for that. that their secretary was typing stuff up and she kept adding jokes and they said, "You're hilarious. Why don't you write?" They were getting scripts sent to them from young women through their dentists. They were, like all of this stuff. And they would really take a lot of these women and mentor them through. And then these women went out and did other things.
In the spinoffs, the Rhodas.
Rhoda, for sure. First female showrunner ever.
Yes.
Was Rhoda. So a couple of them were involved in things like founding Comedy Central, okaying The Daily Show, all of this stuff. And that's where you really see,
the payoff. All right. Rhoda, Phyllis, and Lou Grant, all spinoffs from the Mary Tyler Moore Show.
I mean, Rhoda broke records, particularly when she got married, which I don't know what that says about society in itself. But people were really stoked on Rhoda getting married, and that broke all kinds of records for viewing. And there was like all these great little, classic anecdotes about how like Monday Night Football, the guys were talking about like, well, you should probably go watch Rhoda's wedding now. Like it was a national event is really the point. And it had some rocky, it turned out they ended up not liking Rhoda's husband very much and getting rid of him pretty quickly. She got a divorce then, which
wasn't good enough for her.
Thing. Right.
Yeah, that's right. That too was pretty groundbreaking. When the Mary Tyler Moore shows started, they had actually pitched the idea that she was going to be divorced, and the network said absolutely not, because people hate divorced people. In fact, what they said is people do not want to see divorced people, Jews, or people with mustaches on television, is what they said. Fascinating.
And by the way, I think we know what that means.
Yes.
That means that cis white men don't want to see that.
That's correct.
Yeah.
That is exactly right. Oh, and they also said people from New York, which like, if you just think of so many classic successful shows, like that knocks out Seinfeld. If they just like had a mustache on Seinfeld,
they would have had everything.
Right? Like, I mean, it's hilarious, but also horrible and bigoted. So, but if you think about, then Rhoda comes along. By the time her spinoff happens, she has become quite overtly Jewish. She used to be kind of secretly Jewish, like many characters, but she became pretty overtly Jewish. Val, who played her, Valerie Harper, was a, outspoken feminist. She was on the cover of Ms. Magazine. She was friends with Gloria Steinem. And so you can see just in those couple of years, the evolution that had happened, and it had a female showrunner too. And tons of the women who wrote for the Mary Tyler Moore Show just hopped over and wrote for Rhoda. So that was great.
And got that very important second credit. You have to get the second credit. You have to find ways to move up. And then it gets easier to get the third, fourth, an ongoing career.
Right.
Even Lou Grant.
Yeah, a lot of the same writers.
There's a woman director in the list, and 7 of the 30 writers listed for Lou Grant are women. Not as good as Mary Tyler Moore, but it's pretty good for that time.
It's pretty good for that time. And that's a drama too, which I can imagine that some of the women maybe wanted to make that pivot or have that quiver in their era, whatever, And Ed Asner claims to have become a feminist essentially because of the Mary Tyler Moore Show. That's what he told me anyway, because he kind of came in very not really thinking about it that much. And in fact, at first didn't really love the idea of women writing for him. And by the end, one of the writers showed me this beautiful letter he wrote to her, thanking her for writing the episode that won him an Emmy. He did become active in women's causes in addition to all of his other causes. And I believe that it really did help him to kind of understand that the women can write television too. And I don't remember if I talked to him specifically about like getting women hired on that show, but certainly I think he was open to it at minimum, if not openly pushing for that.
Well, I think if he had objections to it, it wouldn't have happened.
That's right.
His character's name is on the show.
Yeah, exactly.
So how did you get started in writing about pop culture and women in pop culture? What's that journey look like for you?
The main answer to that is that I was on staff for 10 years at Entertainment Weekly, and that was 2002 to 2011. And so that's like the short answer. I started as an assistant and kind of worked my way up. And of course, I had always been writing about pop culture before that and loved it and et cetera. You can't just show up there and, like, I enjoy television. Yes, everyone enjoys television. You have to be like a super nerd and all of that stuff. But worked my way up and also found my way through. I was the assistant for what they called the news and notes section, which is like that front of the magazine where it's just like a bunch of little things. So it was kind of everything. And then eventually I worked my way into the television department. And I wouldn't have told you necessarily that that was what was going to happen when I started there. I kind of felt like I loved everything equally, TV and movies and music, but ended up in the TV department. And I was kind of a nerd about television and TV history. And I used to like get my TV guides every week. I mean, as a child, we would get the TV guide and I would circle everything I was going to watch for the week. And then I'd read all the articles. So like it was there, and eventually, was a television writer and became a senior writer, I believe. And that was a really nice job, especially at that time. I mean, it got tough near the end because cuts and cuts and cuts in magazines, but I was there for like a good chunk of kind of
the power
really
time. Yeah.
Beautiful,
Yeah.
like, let's just stay at the best hotels. And, I went to Hawaii for a week to be on the set of Lost. I was constantly going to the set of Grey's Anatomy, many, many other things. And in that process, you'd usually have a couple of specialties, even within your specialty, if that makes sense. Like you'd have a number of television writers and then we'd all have our little domains. And so Grey's Anatomy was one of them for me. And that was partly because I was like the women in television girl. A lot of women in comedy. A big thing for me besides Grey's Anatomy was essentially Tina Fey in 30 Rock. I was on that set a bunch of times, interviewed her a bunch of times. It was kind of the rise of Tina Fey at that time.
Mm-hmm.
That was the Palin, 30 Rock, whole thing years. So she was a big superstar for us and we were always covering her. I'm sorry to say I also did a lot of Apprentice and Trump.
I'm so sorry.
Sorry.
So that happened. And when I did that Mary Tyler Moore Show book, no one understood this idea of I'm going to write a book about a TV show. The publishers were like, and I found one that was like a big fan of the Mary Tyler Moore Show and wanted to make it happen. And he kind of got it. And it really wasn't until I wrote my next book about Seinfeld and it became a bestseller that, I mean, it's just true that it's kind of what made this genre happen was when that book became a success, everyone went, oh, okay. And then now you see lots of these kinds of books. It's very normal, but it really was not normal until Seinfeldia happened. And then we saw that it was actually could be successful.
What do you think is the hardest book of yours that you wrote?
I love it. No one's asked me that. And I love that question. That's such a good one. I'm going to say When Women Invented Television, just because, I mean, I love it. It's actually probably my favorite too, but it was different than what we're talking about. After Seinfeld, I did Sex and the City. And then I was like, I kind of want to try something different. And so I had this idea percolating since the Mary Tyler Moore Show and decided to try to make it happen. It was hard to pitch. A lot of places said no. A lot of places said things like, it's kind of depressing because they didn't all get together and overthrow the patriarchy. And I was like, well, I think they were depressed about that too. But they were pretty bummed too that they didn't overthrow the patriarchy. But that's why we don't know their story. Yeah, like this is it's another answer to why don't we know their stories. I thought that was so interesting. In a like inside baseball way, there was this real resistance to not having like this inspirational story. And I had to kind of work to make them feel inspirational, even though there was a little bit of a, downslope to a lot of those stories because things went poorly starting in 1955, right?
Yeah.
I thought they were inspiring though, regardless. Like the fact that these women did this is inspiring. And that's what I wanted to focus on. But it took a while to kind of figure all of that out. I was dealing with 4 different women's stories. It's a lot of stories and they didn't know each other.
Yeah.
And so that was complicated. I wish they had all also been best friends. That would have made my life a lot easier.
Ladies who lunch.
That's right. And
hey, we're the queens of television.
I kind of feel like, I mean, I'm not saying they had no friends and no friends in the industry, but part of my perception was that they were so busy just fighting for their lives all the time. They did not have time to go find other women and be like, are you having this problem too? There weren't women's groups yet. And so there wasn't that camaraderie. They were just fighting for their lives. And so all of those things. And then the fact that I went into it knowing 3 of these 4 women are dead, long dead. And they did have archives. And I loved that. But it was a lot of both just learning a little bit of a different kind of research and also putting together a different story that was way more complicated. So that, I think, was probably the hardest.
Inspiration can come from seeing that someone tried, had some success, and then, things went awry. Because it shows you the possibility. It shows you that somebody else has already kind of started down that road, and now there's room for me to try to go in there and move the ball even forward.
Yeah.
The fact that they existed, is inspiring.
It really is. And to be honest, like, we probably don't know the half of what these women went through.
Mm-hmm.
You know, people would always ask me, I'm like, well, they didn't put in their archive. You know, I don't know. Yeah. People ask me things like, you know, were they queer? Were they I'm like, I just know what they put out there, and we can guess at things. But I mean, I hate to even think about it, but it's like, just who knows the stuff they saw and just dealt with. I was able to track some of it. That alone was shocking. The amount of sexism, for instance, just overtly in pieces that men wrote about Betty White is one example, which again, I cannot fathom being horribly sexist to Betty White, but they were. My friend actually it's so beautiful. She can draw, and she drew the 4 of the women together for me. And I have it framed, and I love it because it's like, I do think about them. If I'm having a hard time, if I'm having a bad day, right? It's like, well, think of what Gertrude did, or think of what Irma did. They dealt with so much more. And like you said, paved the way so that we don't have to deal with quite that amount.
Yeah, I think it's totally inspiring because it's like Hidden Figures, right? Like, it's like no one knew about them, but now we do.
That's right. And we pitched this as Hidden Figures for early television. Okay. Like, that was totally my pitch, you know, because it's the way people can most sort of understand this, for sure.
Yeah. All right. Well, you have a new book.
Yes. This is about the movie Mean Girls. And while it is about a movie, so that's slightly different. That's the first time I've ever done that. It has so many ties to things I've written about before, and really television. It's as close to a TV show as a movie can be, right?
It is. And it's Tina Fey, right?
It's Tina Fey.
Tina Fey wrote
to me,
that. Yeah.
Yeah. That was the biggest draw for me initially, was just, what's a way to write about Tina Fey's, I don't want to say legacy because that makes it sound like she's not going to work anymore. But, you know, like, I think she has a significant legacy that we can already see at this point. She was in that wave of the 2000s of, like, we still didn't have a ton of female showrunners. And I think of her and Shonda kind of like coming out about the same time. And for her starring in her own show too. And I think she has the most, or one of the most influential comedic voices in television of our time. A lot of things that came after 30 Rock are imitations of 30 Rock. There is a certain like cadence, and she does, I wish I had a better word for this, but she does dense throwaway jokes. Just joke and joke and joke and joke and joke. And you can watch 30 Rock 7 times before you get every joke, because they are just all coming all the time. And so many shows after it started doing this, the kind of non sequitur joke, all of that. And she pioneered that. And you can see it. It's not exactly the same in Mean Girls, but it's there. And think of the amount of quotable lines in that movie. Like, on Wednesdays, we wear pink, and who here has been personally victimized by Regina George. Just so many things that have become references. I call it Seinfeld for millennial women and gay men.
Yeah.
And because there's this really interesting, and I cover this in the book, there's this really interesting trajectory where Mean Girls becomes way more popular in its afterlife. And it's because it came out in 2004, and it's like, then the internet. It's just right at the time when social media becomes prevalent. Facebook was invented the same year. And so it takes off in the next few years, and then memes happen, which who saw that coming? Memes need quotes. And Mean Girls is like one of the first to be memed everywhere. It runs into a lot of different interesting strands, like feminism of the 2000s, which I call like pink shiny feminism, right? There's like this like mainstreaming of feminism that Mean Girls really embodies. There's like tabloid culture and Lindsay Lohan. My favorite thing that I did is I talked to a bunch of the people who played the ancillary, just the high schoolers. They're all Canadians because they filmed in Canada. It's amazing. The high school is entirely populated by Canadians. And each of them has like 1 to 3 immortal lines, right? I have a wide set vagina and heavy flow. All of these, I talked to Glenn Coco, all of these people who became memes, who are now famous for being memes. And I'm fascinated by this. Like, they too think it's the weirdest thing. It's like one day they were just going about their business. And then around 2007, they woke up and were famous from the internet for one line. And then it's just like them in their 20s on a loop saying one line for eternity. And they say like their phones blow up at certain times when one of their memes is used because of a news event. They'll get a bunch of, they're like, oh my God, is someone dead? And they're like, no, your meme is just being used a lot because, Donald Trump's daughter's shoe line got dropped from Nordstrom. And so the woman who says you should try Sears is like...
suddenly is hot again.
Suddenly is hot again for like 24 hours. And I'm fascinated by stuff like that.
Was there anything you found in writing this book about a movie that was different than writing about a television show in some way?
A lot of ways, actually. I was wary, and this is why, is because a movie takes not very long to make. This took, I can't remember precisely, but something like 6 weeks to make. On the other hand, when I wrote about Seinfeld, it's like 9 seasons of stuff happening between people. It's sort of interesting in a way because we put all this stuff on these people and we imagine relationships among them and things like that. And yes, the girls really are still in touch. They just did a great Walmart spot, and they're all aware that they're famous in relation to each other. But they really, in some cases, only spent 6 weeks together ever in 2003. And that's it. And so the production part is actually pretty quick. And it was a very nice production. Sort of unfortunately for me, it was a very nice production.
Well, Canada.
No, I'm not even kidding. These Canadians are so nice. They're so nice.
Very nice.
And I do think Canada had a lot to do with this because, you're not in Los Angeles while this is happening. And this really has continuing resonance, I think, because unfortunately, the central problem it's addressing has not abated. It probably has become worse, right?
Mm-hmm.
As the internet comes into play, it's like bullying and all of that have become so much more of a flashpoint. If you think about that movie, it's sort of funny because it's barely any cell phones. Regina has to make photocopies of the burn book in order for people to see it all. The new musical movie addresses all of these things and brings it into the modern age more. I think that's a really good idea. Making it into a musical and then making it into a movie musical. I think it's all a trajectory that I'm into. I think if you're going to do reboots, that's the way to go about it.
Yeah, the musical is quite charming. It's really fun.
It's really fun. I was nervous and it was fun.
Yeah.
Well, I'm usually not someone who, in general, I don't like movies, TV shows about teenagers. Every now and then one comes along that's the exception to the rule. And Mean Girls was definitely one of those exceptions to the rules. That's such a fun movie. And I probably have to go home tonight and watch it after we're done.
Yay, I love that. Endlessly rewatchable. And I think the reason that you feel that way about it, if I may, is that it's good. You don't have to like the genre. It's just unbelievably funny. And this is what I go back to with Tina Fey. And I make this point in the book a lot, is that teen girl stuff wasn't allowed to be that funny. It's this is Caddyshack funny.
Yeah.
This is Blues Brothers funny. This is Guy funny. I hate saying that, but you know what I mean by that, right? Is
yes.
Ghostbusters gets to be funny, the original. Let's not get into all that. But no other, especially teen girl thing, had been allowed to have this density of jokes. It's just like I was saying about 30 Rock.
Yeah.
There's a joke and a joke and a joke and a joke and a quotable line and a joke. And nothing else had been just relentlessly funny like that.
Just to bring it back to our podcast for a minute.
Oh, that's weird.
Do you have any 80s favorite ladies-driven television shows that you watched or enjoyed or might want to write a book about someday?
I mean, Golden Girls is the gold standard.
Yes, the brass ring.
I mean, that's another one where you can watch. And I think, again, has a sweetness to it in addition to being really funny. Seeing those women together is really what we love. And again, Betty White, genius.
Oh, gosh.
In addition to the other women, of course.
Yeah.
But unbelievable performances.
And it's just powerhouse after powerhouse, both in jokes and delivery in that show.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my God, I just was rewatching some clips and fell down around. It's no, I have to do other things. Someone asked me to find one clip, and then I was just watching Golden Girls. And similarly, it's so weird, these two shows, but Designing Women, I actually was like, I don't think I'm going to do this, so I feel like I can say it, but that was on my list when I was considering next books. Like that was one where I was like, maybe, I don't know. And maybe still, who knows? But I think that one is so, I mean, it's like overtly feminist, super socially conscious. I mean, watching those speeches, right? There's so much great, the suits.
It's so great. It's so great. And we got to talk to Linda Bloodworth-Thomason, who's amazing. And again, does not get her due.
Completely.
For being one of those groundbreaking women who kind of reopened television for women at that time, and just funny, beautiful writing.
Unbelievable. Like women were not doing it then. There were not women at that time really that much.
Yeah.
She's one too, where I'm like, oh, she's seen some stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like she did what she needed to do and she got through some stuff. I'm sure of it.
Yeah.
It was such a different time. And honestly, like I was also a kid in the 80s. And when I knew I was going to talk to you, like the thing that comes into my head when you say like 80s women television, I go like Facts of Life.
Yes.
Facts of Life was like, I can't even explain. It's so foundational to me. Like, it's so weird. I don't know. I was just truly, you know, when you're a kid, the way you can be obsessed.
Mm-hmm.
I just thought all of those women were so beautiful and cool. And I just thought like, why don't I go to a prep school in Peekskill? And I now live near Peekskill and it's so exciting. I was like, oh my God, Peekskill's real and it's here. And every single one of them, that's what's so interesting to me too, is like, I was obsessed with all of them.
Yeah.
Oh, just Blair.
Yeah.
Was so glamorous, but Joe was so cool.
Yeah. And Tootie was so funny.
And Tootie was so funny. And she had roller skates.
Yeah.
And think of that though. If you do think about that in the television landscape, I mean, I wasn't thinking that way then, but this is a lot of girls on one show.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That was allowed to exist. And for enough years that George Clooney shows up and Mackenzie Astin shows up, what it did that was revolutionary was taking girls' problems seriously while still being very, very funny.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't make the argument that Facts of Life was very, very funny in the same way, but it did take girls' problems seriously. And they did it all. They did all the things. I mean, at least what they could, right?
Yeah.
They did periods and sex and all kinds of things. And I feel like it was really important to me. So Facts of Life, man.
Facts of Life.
Take the good and the bad.
You know, I think of Square Pegs, which had such a, you know, explosion and implosion for so many reasons. And yet this was a mainstay for many years. So it'll be fascinating to look at. Maybe we'll bring you back.
I would love to.
Oh my gosh. So what's next for you? Anything you're working on that you could talk about?
I am working on something, but I can't
talk about
I can tell you after we're done recording.
Okay. All right.
Because I think you'll like it, but
excited.
I can't say it publicly yet.
We can't talk about it now.
Totally understand.
This has been delightful. You're super smart, super informative.
Thank you. You're fun to talk to about this. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thank you very, very much.
It was really fun.
Bye.
Bye.
In today's audiography, you can find Jennifer at her website, jenniferkarmstrong.com.
From her website or our description below, you can find links to her books.
She's also on Instagram at JMKArmstrong.
We're also going to have in our description some links to clips of early 1950s Betty White, Hazel Scott, and Gertrude Berg's The Goldbergs, as well as an episode of Irma Phillips' The Guiding Light, all of which I found on YouTube. Thank you all for listening and for all your feedback and comments. We really appreciate it. Keep them coming.
We really love hearing from you. So if you have anything you want to tell us or suggestions, please send us messages at our website, 80stvladies.com. That's 80stvladies.com.
And you can find us on Instagram, even Twitter, and Facebook at 80s TV Ladies. Oh, also LinkedIn. We're on LinkedIn.
Awesome. And if you like our podcast, please rate us. 5 stars really helps at whatever podcast platform you choose.
That's right. And hey, tell your friends.
As always, we hope 80s TV Ladies brings you joy and laughter and lots of fabulous new and old shows to watch, all of which will lead us forward toward being amazing ladies of the 21st century.
That's right.
See you next time.